multiply sponsored, but in particular tonight, Dana Cloud's visit is sponsored by English. And I'm very excited to have her here. Dana Cloud is a professor in the Department of Communication and Rhetorical Studies at Syracuse University. She's been there since 2015, and prior to that, she was teaching at the University of Texas in Austin for a lot of years. After she got her degree in rhetorical studies at University of Iowa. She's published very widely, treating topics such as Oprah Winfrey, The Matrix, The Bachelor, and The Internationale. She's an award-winning academic. Winning the National Communication Association Communication and Critical Cultural Studies Division Scholar Activist Award in November 2017 for her, she won that in 2017. She was the Outstanding Scholar in 2014 for her article, Shock Therapy, Oprah Winfrey, Celebrity Philanthropy, and Disaster Relief in Haiti. She also won an Early Career Award, the Aubrey Fisher Outstanding Article Award in 1999 for an article entitled The Rhetoric of Family Values, Scapegoating, Utopia, and the Privatization of Social Responsibility. She was the co-editor of The Point is to Change It, Marxism and Communication Studies, that was published in 2006. Her second book, We Are the Union, Democratic Unionism and Dissent at Boeing, was published in 2011. And that book offered an incisive analysis of the 1995 strike at Boeing in Wichita and Seattle. And it outlined the ways in which rank and file workers challenged the all too cozy relationship between union leadership and corporate management in ways that modeled fighting an institution while simultaneously using it as a tool. But she's here today to talk about her most recent book, Reality Bites, The Rhetorical Circulation of Truth Claims in U.S. Political Culture. This was just published in March. So she actually has copies, many copies here, that she's selling at a discount and is happy to sign afterwards. Even this one still sounds crunchy. This book offers a straightforward and brilliant corrective to the claims of fake news and the constant barrage of dog-wagging and racist, sexist, and warmongering bluster. It asks us to take the popularity of Donald Trump seriously, and it offers a toolkit for becoming critical mediators, to use her term, armed with the ability to frame shift, another one of her terms, and to zero in on the issues that matter to all of us, to see the opportunities for organizing to change the conditions of our lives. As an academic and an activist, Dana intervenes intellectually at cultural pressure points, where she sees battles articulated and she diagnoses cultural debates in ways which open on to ways of organizing, to challenge gender inequality, sexism, racism, and economic exploitation. She writes with tremendous hope, and that hope comes from years of activity as a political organizer and as a socialist. She is committed to the taking political stands and to fighting for the importance of academic freedom. She does this in her classrooms, in her writing and speaking, and on the streets, in her activism and organizing as a socialist. This has garnered her some different kinds of attention, attracting the right-wing trolls last year after she tweeted during a counter-protest. She was protesting with the New York Antifa, standing for an anti-fascist alliance, that was there as part of a counter-protest to the Act for America anti-Sharia demonstration in Syracuse. So this, she tweeted during that, and there was tremendous backlash to the point where she got, there were tweets that called for her firing, and it went all the way up the administration at Syracuse, and luckily, and after organizing and pressure, right, she had university support for academic freedom, but she since then has, and that wasn't the first time that you've received any kind of blacklisting. She's on a number of websites as supporting boycott, divestment, sanctions from Israel, and been outspoken. So she's a model, an activist, a scholar. But she's here today to talk about her book, and which is related, because it couldn't be more important or relevant in its argument for a way to understand this current thrall of fact-checking and the discourse of fake news. It couldn't be more important given the news flows that we're experiencing, the simultaneity of events and experiences, the triumphs and self-activity of teachers in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Colorado, and soon Washington State. At the same time that the United States has once again offered military
have a PowerPoint, but I do think I have something interesting. Well, it's not that interesting, but it is an outline because I thought I'm going to be talking for a while, and there is some complexity to what I'm going to say, and so you might want to. It's a roadmap, you know. So that's how I roll. I'm not super fancy. I tried to make it bigger. Can people read it? Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. So before I get started, I want to ask, first of all, how y'all are doing? Good? Good, yeah? Snowing sideways? Like, why? I don't understand it. It's raining in Syracuse right now, but it's cold. So I just want to thank you for being here. And mostly students? Okay, cool. And I understand that you read a piece of mine, maybe a chapter called Pants on Fire. And I'm happy to take questions about that or about this chapter. They're closely related. The other question I have is, okay, so Paige just told you what rhetoric is, right? The study and practice of public influence, which is what media studies is also about. It's just that I'm going to use the word rhetoric several times, and so I don't want you to feel alienated by it. The other thing, two questions. One is, what do you think of when I say new media? New media. Huh?
Social medias.
Social media? What else? I hear muttering. Speak up. Internet, thank you. So mainly we think about computer-mediated communication when somebody says new media. But what if I were to tell you that Thomas Paine, during the American War for Independence, was engaging in the production of new media? I'll come back to that claim in a minute, but he was using a brand new form of media that actually produced a new kind of common sense in society that challenged the rule of monarchs and did so in a way that really galvanized the American Revolution. So I want you to keep that in mind. And then the other thing is, what do people know about Tom Paine? He wrote Common Sense. What else do you know? Did you read it? Anybody read it? Do you like it? it's not nearly as boring as you might have thought in history class. That's the other thing I'm going to try to convince you of. So there's a lot to say, but I guess I'll just dig into my prepared remarks. Look alive, and also if you have any questions while I'm talking, just raise your hand, because I don't want to be, abstruse or opaque for you. All right, so basically, as was just said, I'm a progressive intellectual and activist, and it's very uncomfortable for me to face the fact that we do not, so there are a number of claims that are circulating in political culture that have no basis in reality, right? And they are persuasive anyway. That's a very frustrating thing. Have you ever been at a debate where one side had all the facts and the other side just had emotion and storytelling and they won? Anybody ever happen? It's frustrating, right? As a leftist, I was always thinking, well, I could just speak truth to power and just offer some evidence, and everybody would then change their mind, and it would be awesome. And facing the uncomfortable reality that that's not how it works. And I should have known better, because I'm a rhetorician, and I study how influence happens, and usually it doesn't happen like that. So basically, the left is trafficking predominantly in the assertion of truths against what we think should be obvious falsehoods that control political knowledge, for example, regarding creationism and climate change. The left is armed with science, history, and buckets full of facts, and we attempt to speak truth to power. In other words, we assume that in any controversy, the person who has the truth on her side will eventually win the day. And this assumption is just not true. The truth does not necessarily set us free. Indeed, the powerful often control the circulation and authority of what counts as truth. So in my book in general, I argue that the rhetorical strategies of the reality-based community, that is the left, are limited in its commitments to rationalism and too simple-minded understandings of truth. At the same time, I don't want to go to the other extreme and basically say everything is true, nothing is false, right? That's relativism, right? That's a philosophical position that I don't enjoy. But there's something in between, right? Which is the middle way that I call rhetorical realism, which is the idea that there is a reality, but none of us can know it except through frames of mediation or interpretation by politicians, activists, pundits, and the mass media. So the necessity of mediation, the making of media, and also the intervening in the process of communication means that we can't just put facts in front of audiences and expect them to respond meaningfully. Instead, I think the left should take up some of the compelling rhetorical mediation tools that the right has long embraced. These are emotion, and I'm not going to take time, there's a whole chapter in the book about these things: emotion, embodiment, narrative, myth, and spectacle. I call these the big five. The right always uses those things, and the left has always thought, oh, those are manipulative, appealing to people's emotions, that's bad. In fact, that is not bad if it helps build our side, in the struggle for power in society. So basically, it is in the mediation of information in the transition to the public domain where rhetorical intervention may translate knowledge and situate it in sensible interpretive frames. And such invention may take conservative form when corporate media and interests control mediation. And we certainly know what that looks like. However, when social struggle and alternative political organizations mediate collective experience, as during the Black Lives Matter movement, the resulting contestation between a set of beliefs that are true for elites and the organized experiential knowledge of ordinary people enable critique and social transformation. If dominant reality bites in being oppressive and exploitative, an oppositional reality-based community can bite back. And this book explores when and how democratic contestation over reality occurs. I also argue in the book that the responses by liberals and progressives to the crisis of truth in U.S. political culture have been mistaken in their focus on the minutiae of fact-checking. Those farther on the left still tend to hold with the empirical evidence. I just want to say that I'm not against evidence-based reasoning, but I just think that we must attend more thoughtfully to the overall process of mediation, the role that communication plays in the circulation of knowledge, especially the knowledge that we need to give voice to our reality, our truths, and our struggle. So, I talked about the big five. All right. So, in this particular chapter, which is about Thomas Paine and Black Lives Matter, I raised the same questions that are throughout the whole book, but with regard to a special case, which is the case of a revolution. And I chose the American Revolution. There have been other revolutions, and they have some similarities. But for a couple of reasons. Well, one is that probably y'all know something about the American Revolution. And second, I chose it because of Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine wrote the pamphlet Common Sense, and the very name of the pamphlet speaks to my concern about how we can bring knowledges of subordinated groups into popular consciousness such that they become common sense and replace the common sense that came before, right? So he challenged and replaced previous dogmas, and now I know why I can't see. All right, so a revolutionary situation in this regard is unique, it's rare, but momentous in its significance. And so as a socialist and a lifetime activist, I and many others am interested in how communicators can inject new political truths into a society in the midst of major crisis. So Tom Paine can teach us now how to inject new common sense into society in the process of social change. There is some controversy about whether the American War for Independence represented a significant or radically transformative revolution. A number of scholars and historians have argued that it was simply a political revolution and not a social revolution, which would have entailed massive redistribution of wealth and changes in the basic structure of the basic class structure of society. But, and I can go into that for a long time, but I won't. So basically, I would say that even if this revolution was not a deep-reaching social revolution, the contrast to a political revolution, it did require a war, and motivation for that war required a new political language. You know, Herbert Aptheker, a historian, said that there was incredible pressure on the merchant class from below during the American Revolution. You may know that during the Revolution, the War for Independence, that it was mainly merchants who were chafing against the autocratic rule of the British monarchy, right? I mean, the emphasis on taxation, on free trade, on the right to keep the profits of your own work, all kinds of things. But these merchants were kind of an elite in the budding and emerging society, which was capitalism. And so they were chafing against monarchical rule, but they had to involve all kinds of other people, all the working people, all the poor people, all the, and not slaves, although, I mean, we can talk about that later too. But all the people who were political agents in colonial society basically wanted the revolution to have more democratic content, like not just for the merchants, like more money for merchants? I don't know, that's not like gonna get me going, right? So these ideals about democracy and human rights and individual privacy and liberty, you know, were amplifying the revolution and really contained a seed, though, of actual democratic and not just hypocritical content. So therefore, there was a task of having to motivate Americans who were unfamiliar with the language of democracy and independence, right? So common sense that people inherited when they moved to the colonies and were, you know, living life. The common sense was, of course, you know, power should be inherited down, you know, by right of possession through generations of monarchs, right? That's common sense. It's hard to break with common sense. And so winning people to an idea of democracy and independence to support a decolonizing war required a lot of mediating work. In a specifically revolutionary situation, timing, the quality of the intervention, and the capacity of the communicator to make the right intervention at the right time are crucial. And in the rhetorical theory of the ancient Greeks, the idea of using a well-timed, situated political judgment in the context of crisis is called kairos, timing, opportunity. It's a really special word that basically says, here was a person and a text, an instance of media that intervened in exactly the right way at exactly the right time. And it doesn't happen as often as you like, and when it does, it's really worth taking a look at. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on Paine and the American Revolution, and then I'm going to perform an analysis of common sense, and then I'm going to talk about how Paine was using the pamphlet as an emerging form of media to make a vernacular, which means bottom-up production of ideas and knowledge, similar to the efforts of many social movements throughout U.S. history. In Common Sense, he develops narratives, including mythic ones, big narratives, to describe the heroes, villains, values, responsibilities, and destinies of the revolution. His use of emotional appeals is notable as well. The most important aspect of his intervention into the revolution as a mediator is how exactly at the right moment he moved the leftmost edge of liberalism into intelligibility for large parts of the population. He made radical concepts seem like common sense. That's kind of amazing. So, and that's the part of the population who would not necessarily fight for free trade, but who would fight for the ideas of democratic representation and equal rights. So then I'll end, I'll do an analysis of the pamphlet and then observe how it works as ideology, mediation, and social change. And then I'm going to compare that work with the work of black intellectuals in the Black Lives Matter movement. All right, so the American War for Independence and the need for a new common sense. When Paine crafted and published the pamphlet Common Sense in 1776, he had been in Philadelphia for just over a year. The war was a long shot for the Patriots, and many colonists were neutral on the question of independence or loyalty to the crown. The elite discourses of the intellectual leaders of the Revolution, including John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, did not reach the mass of colonists, most of whom were artisans, craftspeople, and owners of small home-based businesses, and laborers. The artisans had already become politically active, having founded the Patriotic Society and a militia. Open military engagement with the British had begun the year before at Lexington and Concord, and General George Washington was dealing with very low troop morale. You probably know some of this from history classes. So it was into this context that Paine introduced common sense, and it had an explosive effect. It articulated some of the most radical ideas of the Enlightenment about liberty and was shocking in its intensity regarding the despotism of monarchical rule. In spite of, or because of its radicalism, it went through 24 editions and sold hundreds of thousands of copies in its first year, reaching many thousands more, and this is a really fun point, as it was read aloud in taverns, coffee houses, and street fairs, and on battlefields. So, so it's kind of also like new media. Like basically people would take, my computer's encrypted, I wish I could make it not sleep, and I probably can, but not right now. All right, so I'll just kind of touch it periodically. So, reading aloud, taverns, coffee houses, street fairs, battlefields. So like we think about new media now as DIY, when individuals can contribute and produce it, and then it circulates in an informal economy, and it's not controlled from the top down. And this is what happened with Common Sense. It was this new form, it was a pamphlet, and there was a literacy problem, among the colonists, especially the colonists who needed democracy the most. And so people would carry it and hand it hand to hand to people and read it out loud to people who couldn't read it for themselves. It was read on the front lines of the war and motivating the troops in this way, right? And also just really infused colonial society at that time. And in fact, commentators at the time credited the pamphlet with playing a pivotal role in winning the population and the troops in favor of independence at any cost. You know, I was just thinking about things that we circulate, like memes or videos on YouTube, and GIFs. For example, did y'all see the SNL sketch called "Welcome to Hell"? It was in the wake of the emerging Me Too movement and the fall of all the abusers, not all of them, obviously. But basically, SNL put out a sketch called Welcome to Hell, and you can look at it when you want to, and it's a song, and it basically is all about women's daily lives as basically being kind of a living hell, but it's kind of funny too. And I swear to God, I would go around showing that to people, men and women, in order to get them to see kind of where women were coming from on this question of sexual harassment and abuse. And so I was using it kind of like they would use the common sense in taverns, reading it aloud. I would be like, okay, you have to check this out. So it may not be just as deep, I don't know, as this, but I think about the commonalities between how we in a democratic society can circulate our pieces of information, our thoughts, our perspectives, in a kind of similar way. So anyway, so commentators were like, yeah, this was huge. Some of them said, Paine was able to encourage the coming together of 13 diverse colonies and helped sustain this energy even during the harsh and demoralizing winter of 1776 when Washington's troops were ready to quit. Now, the content of the pamphlet was informed by Enlightenment rationality, a weird theology, deist theology. He was religiously interesting. Newtonian science, reason, natural order, and empirical observation. The pamphlet was shorter and less expensive than a book, and longer and more detailed than a broadside. And it was a new medium of communication, one well suited to Paine's democratizing purposes. And the content of the pamphlet can't be separated from its style. They both expressed a new vision of the access of ordinary people and to the political process and to representation in it. So Common Sense has 3 sections after an introduction, and in the introduction, Paine says, consider new ideas with open minds. And I'll just quote him. I'm going to quote him some now, so I'm sorry if that's less interesting to you, but I think it is interesting. So here he writes in the introduction, perhaps the sentiments contained in the following pages are not yet sufficiently fashionable to procure them general favor. A long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right, and raises at first a formidable outcry in defense of custom, but the tumult soon subsides. Time makes more converts than reason. This is, I think, a really interesting passage because he basically explains how ideology works and how common sense works. So he basically says, look, you guys have held on to your existing common sense for a long time. They have been in favor for a long time. And we have a long habit of not thinking the monarchy wrong. And so we think it's right, but that's superficial. And we first think we're going to defend custom, but basically over time, we're going to see that these new ideas are right. I mean, that's kind of interesting because he has established what it means to critique dominant ideology, and he expresses his understanding that people who are used to one way of thinking may find it difficult to accept the new. He breaks the connection between the familiar and the true. And so this is, for today, this is very important to talk to people about how what they're familiar with is not necessarily what is true. And he calls attention to how experience and the passage of time will prove him right. I was thinking about this, I was actually thinking about Tom Paine at the train station the other day when a woman was sitting across from me and she's watching news and something, Paul Ryan something, and she says, I just hate that guy. And I'm like, well, I don't have a lot of excitement about any of them. And she says, oh, we can't talk about politics. And I said, game on, like that's what I do for a living. So, and she said, well, people just hate on each other if they're not gonna take what you say seriously. And then she told me she was a Trump supporter, and she told me why. And I kind of said what Tom Paine just said, right? Like, I totally understand where you're coming from. I don't think Trump is going to be great for us. Time will tell, And she thanked me for not, bashing her or yelling at her or hating her or thinking her stupid. And I just kind of see that approach as being very helpful. So anyway, so then I'm only to the next paragraph of the introduction. He basically says that by inflicting violence and abuse upon the oppressed, the powerful call their privilege into question, and in matters which might never have been thought of, nor had not the sufferers been aggravated into the inquiry. So basically he's saying, those people of privilege, those merchants, they don't know how you suffer, right? And so your suffering will generate critique and critical thought about their goals, and that we should engage in critique and resistance. And he's saying, look, relate this to your personal experience. Now that's pretty awesome, right? All right, so, and in the rest of the introduction, Paine says, I'm not telling you about my own personal life, but I'm going to talk about universal principles. And then he says, the laying a country desolate with fire and sword, declaring war against the natural rights of all mankind, and extirpating the defenders thereof from the face of the earth is the concern of every man to whom nature hath given the power of feeling. And so then he goes into the body of the pamphlet, the first being on the origin and design of government in general, with remarks on the English Constitution. And so he starts slow. He's not calling for independence yet. That's not until the final section. He says, maybe we should think about how the government is intolerable because it encroaches upon democratic society, a domain of positive, productive, voluntary social interaction outside of government influence. And he says, and by the way, human nature, those kings think that human nature is base, and that's why, like Hobbes, like we need to be controlled. We need kings because we're stupid and base. And he says, we are not. There's a vision of human nature that is different. And so then he goes on to say, on the monarchy and hereditary succession, and this is kind of a funny passage because he condemns the English Constitution and he makes fun of the inheritance of power by the reproduction of kings. And he's kind of sexist in this section. I'm not going to go into that a lot, but basically he mocks the idiotic monarchs that have preceded the present King George. So he's like, these people are not in a position to govern us. And then he says that the division of society into classes of kings and subjects is not natural. And in many societies there have not been any kings. And so he refers to the Bible at this point, talking about the folly of kings and making God, the idea of God, stand in for natural rights, which should rule over humanity. I'm skipping something, so if this doesn't make sense, just let me know later. All right, so basically, hereditary succession is unjust, unnatural, and fueled by habit and superstition, like original sin, he says. One bad decision echoes across history as depraved monarchs follow the corrupt and incompetent. He calls monarchs depraved ruffians, savages, and plunderers who leave the people to be ruled by minors and any other manner of the unfit. And then he makes a transition to talk about how the closer a government comes to a republic, the less it needs a king. And then he drops the other shoe, right? So on the present state of American affairs, it returns to this very interesting idea that he started it with, that I know that you have prejudices, you have ideas that you come here with, and you have experiences, and you have common sense, and you've been living with it for a really long time. But he then says, now do a thought experiment with me to overcome your former ways of thinking. And he says also to refer to your own experience again. So he says that, so then he refutes a number of arguments about in favor of the British, and then he launches into an extended and lyrical rationale for independence. And I'm just going to read those couple of sentences to you. They're very dramatic. So he says, everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. The weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. 'Tis time to leave, to separate from England, and urges people to make that happen now. And then he does this again, where he really appeals to people's emotions. And this is a passage I'm going to come back to, so I'm going to read it. Totally reaching out to their experience and their feelings. He says, hath your house been burnt? Hath your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to lie on or bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or child by their hands, and yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? If you have not, then you are not the judge of those who have. But if you have, and can still shake hands with the murderers, then you are unworthy of the name of husband, father, friend, or love. And whatever may be your rank or title in life, you have the heart of a coward and the spirit of a sycophant. So basically, he basically says, remember what I said, like talk about your own experience. If you're poor, if you've been, a victim of violence, if you have not a decent house, if you've lost a parent or a child, then you know what I'm talking about. You know what I'm talking about. And if you haven't, you don't get to talk right now, right? I mean, that's basically what he says. And so he calls people on that basis to awake from their slumbers and to resist reconciliation and put all their support behind severing their connection with the British rule. So then he proposes a kind of Republican government, which goes by the wayside, and then he says, toward the end, "Oh, ye that love mankind, ye that dare oppose not only the tyranny but the tyrant, stand forth. Every spot of the old world is overrun with oppression. Freedom hath been hunted round the globe. Asia and Africa have long expelled her. Europe regards her like a stranger, and England hath given her warning to depart. Oh, receive the fugitive, and prepare in time an asylum for mankind." So basically, he starts slow, talking about, I know where you're coming from, listen to your experience, goes over the idiocy of kings, returns to experience, returns to that patient argument, and then basically says, look, I've put you in this corner now, that there's only one choice now, and we have to support the war for independence. So I'm making a transition now. God, where am I on this outline? Oh, good. I'm really doing well. I'm already. Here. All right. So these are not my regular glasses. So not doing bad. All right. So scholarly research on Paine's rhetorical efforts has identified how, in this crucial moment, Paine used new media to reach broad audiences with the most radical ideas of the Enlightenment. And in the process, he constituted a public sphere of ordinary people. About the use of an emerging or new medium, Craig Nelson writes, "Common Sense appeared in the form of a pamphlet, the most popular style of 18th century publishing, as it offered a medium for anyone who could afford the cost of paper and a print shop's fees, with no binding or cover, consisting of between 20 and 80 loosely sewn pages, with costs affordable for almost any would-be author. The longest pamphlets were about the length of today's romance novels or classic mysteries. Costing about $1 and therefore far less expensive than books, pamphlets were just the right length for explaining a position in detail, as well as for being read aloud to the illiterate, an important consideration for those wanting to reach the widest of audiences." So the important part for me here, I mean, it's all important, but the thing I want to call your attention to is about it being a DIY method of communication. That if you were an author, you didn't have to go to a big publisher and take your chances with them, that you could actually create your own little booklet, and printing wasn't expensive, and you could run some copies and see how it did, and then you could run some more. So it's kind of like the idea, he kind of made a zine, and it was pretty awesome. So there. He also, other scholars have said something very important about how he crystallized Enlightenment ideas. So the historian Eric Foner said, "Paine was one of the creators of a secular language of revolution, a language in which timeless discontents, millennial aspirations, and popular traditions were expressed in a strikingly new vocabulary. The very slogans and rallying cries we associate with the revolutions of the late 18th century come from Paine's writings." So these are all the things that he wrote that we take these for granted as common sense, and we use these phrases all the time, but they came from the pamphlet. The rights of man, the age of reason, the age of revolution, and the times that try men's souls. And so Paine helped to transform the meaning of the key words of American political discourse, including the words democracy, equal rights, and republic, and really invoking the God terms of liberal ideology, the ideology of the merchant class. And so he was invested in a more radical adjustment of social relations than the other founding fathers, and he demonstrated this in his producing of a pamphlet that gave access to everybody to the ideas. It wasn't just an elite debate that was going on. And so he also wrote in a simple literary style so that it was accessible to people as well. All right, so, and I'm talking about sort of, remember the big five: emotion, embodiment, narrative, myth, and spectacle. So I'm talking now about how he did that, and one of those was obviously emotional appeal. We've kind of taken a look at that. Other communication scholars have said that he had a new kind of charisma, because he had resonance with the universal sentiment of the people. So that typically charisma was like something that famous and elite people had, but this was a new kind of charisma, they said. Other people have called attention to how he moves audiences. So embodiment, this idea that I was talking about a minute ago about taking people where they are, and sort of in part one, like, hey, I know where you are. And then moving them like to, okay, here's the king. This is a problem, king's a problem. And then moving them over here. So, okay, revisit your personal experience against these ideals. And I think that the conclusion is obvious. So he's moved the people from a place of common understanding to a new common sense, So so that's embodiment, right? And also emotion and metaphor and emotional appeals wrapped up people in the cause, but also comforted them in a time of anxiety. Another lesson that I think we could use during sort of the Trump regime, which is that the rhetoric that Trump offered, which basically secured the election, when we can debate, popular vote and electoral college and so on, but it secured for him the presidency because somebody told me that because it makes ordinary people feel better. I mean, and that's one way that white supremacy is very scary too. It makes white people, especially white men, feel better. This function is called palliative, and it can work for evil, but as pain kind of calls our attention to, it also can be used on the progressive side. Like just because it's an emotional appeal does not mean that we should reject using it. We can say this is why this mediation worked, and condemn the motives and the results, which as I would. But we still aren't going to say, oh, I'm giving up on emotion. I'm not going to do that. That would be really like shooting yourself in the foot. So that's sort of my main argument. All right, so. Also, pain, as I noted before, cultivated a public sphere, and it extended beyond the elites, right? It made people think, it made people practice democracy when they were reading aloud in the tavern or on the battlefield. It turned the people into thoughtful participants in the political process and made it accessible. So he exploits other dichotomies, like this was between the high and the low and the elite and the ordinary, but he basically threw in entertainment, he threw in science and popular culture, and basically all of these appeals, all of these strategies made common sense, play this pivotal role in history. And so the immediate military and constitutional crisis was set in the context of nascent capitalism, for it was those principles that would shore up the rising merchant class's economic and political position. And the efforts of elites toward a new kind of society needed a push from below, couched in terms of equality and rights. And Paine himself represents this very contradiction, pushing the lower orders to participate. But in order to participate, they had to articulate their own demands, and they were more radical. They took the concepts very seriously of equality, right? More seriously than Alexander Hamilton. All right, so John Adams basically said during the time of the Revolution, he said, without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain. So John Adams, in 75, 76, 77, he basically credits Tom Paine with winning the American Revolution. But then later, when Thomas Paine was being too radical and agitational, he called Paine a satyr, which is kind of like a devil, and a mongrel. Every revolutionary crisis finds a point at which its ideals and contradictions find pivotal expression, And Foner writes, Paine was precisely the right man at the right time, articulating ideas which were in the air, but only dimly perceived by most of his contemporaries, helping to promote revolution by changing the very terms in which people thought about politics and society. So he counterposed common sense to prejudice, encouraging the readers to break with the familiar. He consciously mediated. So mediation isn't just something that technology does. It's about what political agents and actors do, getting in the middle of experience and consciousness and interpreting it and offering up this interpretation. So Paine redefined things in a way that really resonates with people and their prejudices as they currently exist. So he's pretty sophisticated in understanding ideology, right? So he says, instead of basically, this is also important too, instead of saying your loyalty to the crown is the result of a pack of lies, right? He could say that. He says no. He says beliefs are a product of the times. And that's a much more productive way of entering a conversation with political antagonists. That I know your beliefs come from your experience and they are a product of the times. And let me then attempt to move you. And I'm going to say what you believe is just a prejudgment. It's just a figment of the time that we're living in. I totally get it. I live here too. Paine did not talk like that. He was fancier. But basically, sophisticated theory of where people's beliefs come from and how to convert them, right? So the hegemony of common sense, the hegemony or dominance of one version of common sense, in this case a monarchical common sense, an elite common sense, is upset by revolutionary crisis. And that provokes anxiety among citizens and maybe a retreat to their comfort. As Paine knew, however, new times require new ideas, pitched as not merely a set of facts. This is key, right? Pitched not merely as a set of facts, but as a reasoned set of interpretations and principles to explain how society could function afresh. Although Paine wanted to call his pamphlet Plain Truth, I'm so glad he didn't. I'm so glad. The purpose of mediation is to offer audiences a coherent articulation of counter-hegemonic ideas in connection with audience members' experience. It is far from offering the plain truth. In fact, I would say there is no plain truth. There is their truth and our truth. I'll come back. And so political activists, commentators, and leaders today should understand that role requires something besides fact-checking. In addition to its historical influence, Paine's work teaches us that meeting citizens in their own language without disdain for the common, understanding the crucial component of timing or kairos, employing narrative, myth, and emotion, and setting forth a set of principles and proposals that connect with the experience of ordinary people will do far better than service to social change than the iteration of old prejudices or pretending that you are in possession of just the facts. So every epoch, so common sense is normally conservative, right? Like you think about common sense, like, oh, it's just common sense that things are the way they are and they should be that way because that's the way they are. But Antonio Gramsci, a Marxist theorist, basically also theorized common sense and basically said that crisis opens up an opportunity for a new common sense to displace the old naturalized beliefs of society. And then the new ideological frame becomes common sense. And so therefore, as I said before, common sense is not the plain truth, it is ideology. And regarding ideologies, we can say that there are the ruling class, the elites' ideologies, and our ideologies. The knowledge, including facts, interpretation, and analysis that can guide social change, even unto revolution, with fidelity to the interests of those it hails. So, I obviously really dig the pamphlet. It has some problems. I didn't talk about the sexism and stuff. There's that. But I think that it basically, at our historical moment, basically asks us the question of, can we see any Tom Paines among us doing this timely work of reading mass audiences with political clarity and motivation and intervening in that situation to take people with a certain common sense and move them along to a new common sense. I argue that we do have such Thomas Paines among us. many activists, but I'm going to focus on intellectuals in the Black Lives Matter movement. When you talk about like quotations like this hashtag, like how do we signal hashtags in, does anybody know, is there a way? I can't, you don't? You say hashtag. Isn't that weird? Like you feel like you should just be able to do that. Okay. All right, the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement. So the movement involves, I can't see you, what did you do? Yeah, that's what I was thinking. All right, so, oh, hashtag. All right. All right. So the movement, though, come on, this is serious. All right, so the hashtag Black Lives Matter movement involves public intellectuals who have created and sustained new publics through the use of emerging media and who understand and communicate about injustice in new, compelling, and condensed language. That's very much like Thomas Paine, right? They employ narrative, myth, embodiment, affect, and spectacle to tremendous effect. And the crisis they have entered into with perfect timing may be more urgent even than Paine's. The leading voices in this movement have begun to describe what it would take to mount a social revolution that can address the deep causes of racist brutality in the United States. So, public intellectuals. Very important. We can be them. So in Gramsci's terms, Paine was an organic public intellectual. Without access to higher education, he steeped himself in public lectures on science and philosophy. In the 18th century context of a blossoming set of publics and counterpublics, he participated in debates over the most pressing questions of his day. He learned the concerns and the language of the people who would be among his readers, and when he intervened, he did so not as an elite figure speaking to the masses, but as one of the people. A public intellectual can be defined, according to Richard Posner, as a person with intellectual resources who writes for broad public audiences on issues of political import. Public intellectuals can operate from outside the communities for whom they speak, but Gramsci argued for the importance of what he called organic intellectuals who emerge as leaders in struggle and are members of the communities that they organize. Pundits and scholars can do good work mediating political information, but I think the most vital work happens from inside communities and movements. Public intellectuals have been important to social movement causes, both modest and revolutionary. They arise out of collective experience and agitation and attempt to generalize and synthesize a political voice that can capture the interests of those seeking change. They do not always do so with fidelity to the people whose struggle they have leveraged, as when media empire owner Oprah Winfrey advises self-help for suffering Black Americans and distances herself from the civil rights movement. We can talk about that too. Although they appear to be individual pundits, gurus, prophets, artists, or other celebrities, it would be wrong to credit any solo effort, one person, with a cause's success. Although, Paine. But if it hadn't been Paine, I think it would have been another person. So Ben Franklin was sort of the understudy for Tom Paine's role in that history. All right, so there are a number of public intellectuals in the United States, most of them Black, from Neil deGrasse Tyson to Henry Louis Gates, Angela Davis, Michelle Alexander, Cornel West, Keeanga Yamada Taylor, Michael Eric Hall. Most of these scholar activists operate from home bases in the academy, and all of them do incredible work as researchers, teachers, translators of ideas, public speakers and writers and activists. They have been mediators of the crises of racialized poverty and the abuses of the U.S. criminal justice system. Each has been a crucial voice in the movement against the police murders of Black people. Outspokenness can be punished as white supremacists and other right-wing organizers make black lists and hit lists containing the names of those who speak out. Their work refutes the common claim that public intellectualism is in decline because they stand up against this stuff, and their audiences belie any claim that the quality of public life is diminished from some historical ideal moment. Patricia Hill Collins, Black feminist scholar, traces the ancestry of U.S. Black public intellectuals to W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells, and wants Black public intellectuals to learn that history and how they weren't, not the first person to, articulate a demand for justice. But I think that Black Lives Matter has been using an emergent medium with a unique capacity to aggregate vernacular voices in the millions And by putting that hashtag out there, a group of women put a piece of explosive common sense into the political world. As the story is usually told, activist Alicia Garza first used the statement Black Lives Matter on Facebook in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman in the shooting death of unarmed black teen Trayvon Martin. On Twitter, Garza's friends Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi repeated the slogan with the hashtag Black Lives Matter. Any denunciation of Twitter culture as debasing political conversation withers in the wake of this moment. The phrase lay dormant for a while. However, after the November 2014 court decision not to indict police officer Darren Wilson, the man who shot to death Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, the use of the hashtag exploded. And the court decision about Wilson was quickly followed by the news of the police murder of Tamir Rice, a boy of 12 in Cleveland. And so around that time, so this data is dated right now, are dated, but the Pew Research Center charted the hashtag's fortunes from its first mention on July 12, 2013 until March 31st, 2016. It was used 13.3 million times, and more if you take into account related hashtags, for example, hashtag Ferguson, hashtag say her name, hashtag I can't breathe, hashtag hands up, don't shoot, and so on. Peaks in its circulation included the murder of Tamir Rice, the announcement in 2014 that Darren Wilson, the police officer who killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, would not be indicted. Again in April of 2015 when Freddie Gray died in police custody in Baltimore, when Bernie Sanders announced his too late support for the movement, and in July 2015 when Sandra Bland was found hanged in her Texas jail cell. So the phrase Black Lives Matter is itself a condensation of an argument. Police killings of black people are wrong. They are happening. They are an indication that black lives do not matter, but black lives do matter. Like Paine's argument for natural rights, it sets forth very plainly a message that galvanized millions of people in a short period of time, not only to circulate information with the hashtag, but also to get involved in organizing. The women who initiated the Black Lives Matter tag created the organization Black Lives Matter, and numerous others followed suit. Pew notes that much of the time, users of the hashtag linked it to anti-racist news of other cases of police murder or movement events. And hashtags could use the hashtag to organize protests. Users used it to stay in constant touch with others around these events. And political analyst Lee Rain told the New York Times, this is a very powerful example of how a hashtag now is attached to a movement, and a movement in some ways has grown around a hashtag, and a series of really painful and really powerful conversations are taking place in a brand new space. Again, kind of like hearing Tom Paine's words read aloud in a street fair. All right, so the Black Lives Matter hashtag's occurrence far exceeded the frequency of the counter hashtag All Lives Matter. A team of researchers in quantitative science at the University of Vermont recently performed an analysis of people using the hashtag and said that they were having informationally rich conversations. It is so cool, and I don't do this work, but I know people who do this work, which is to have programs that visualize the circulation of Twitter messages around nodes or hubs, and then it's some kind of like, remember that toy? What was that toy where it was a circle and it was a pen, and when
you
it
turn it, it would like make a
yeah, it would make like a flower. It was like a circular thing. Anyway, the charts kind of look like that because all of the networks are exploding around hashtags and intellectual hubs, and so what it indicates is actually not an impoverished political conversation, but a truly enriched one, because every use of the hashtag indexes a conversation, right? So it also has enabled some conversations that criticize the movement. Feminists and queer scholars are articulating Black Lives Matter to the police murders, specifically of black women, and to the contributions of feminists and queer activists to the struggle. So the capacity of Twitter and similar online tools to aggregate and coordinate publics, create networks of associations and meanings across topics, and condense meaningful entries into public discourse makes the medium different from non-computer mediated and longer form internet vehicles. In a way, Twitter is like Paine's pamphlet, smaller than a book and accessible to millions of people in a way that even blogs and newspapers are not. The platform enables links to longer narratives and additional information and conspires to conjoin one conversation with others. I feel like I'm running a little short on time. Let's see. All right. Okay. All right, we got it. So, I'm trying to see if any of this material about hashtags, beyond what I just told you, is necessary. So, no. So, Twitter also, in addition to that condensed indexicality, uses other big five strategies: narrative agency, forceful action, embodied action, petitioning, demanding, appealing, and protesting. There's a lot of affective or emotional power in the movement. For example, the death scenes, two ways, like with how the police left Michael Brown in the street, and the image becomes viral as a symbol of total dehumanization. That is very affective and emotionally powerful. But then also, when the activists start committing die-ins, which then reenact the kind of moving awareness of the terror of present police abuse, and also combining that. I saw a die-in, I think that's what I'm referring to right here, where people arrayed themselves like slaves in the Middle Passage, like when you see the charts, the maps of the Middle Passage and the ships where bodies are laid stacked and also like head to foot. And so they would have a die-in that made that arrangement of shape. So it basically connects the police murders to the transatlantic slave trade. So interesting. That is so not like, it's just a hashtag, right? Like it's. So when protesters place their bodies in performative opposition to the rule of law, it makes visible the absences constructed by the devaluation of some people's death. Michael Brown. Okay, I really want to leave some time for discussion, and basically that you can read the chapter also and get a lot of the detail, but I think I'm hitting the most important parts. So, in addition to emotion and embodiment and the condensed narrative, the Black Lives Matter movement also, and this is a quotation from an analyst, introduces new perceptions into the field of sensory experience to invoke a counterworld. I mean, that's pretty awesome. The activist performances are more than what some theorists would describe as disruptive, incomprehensible, or destructive. Instead, they introduce a competing world in which racist injustice becomes visible and intelligible. And that world is invoked in the simple sentence, Black Lives Matter. It provokes the question of whether a world in which Black Lives Matter does, in fact, exist. If not, to state the claim is to insist on the possibility of a counterworld. For example, the image of protesters with raised hands in the hands up, don't shoot gesture affirms both the rationality and the outrage of Black activists in the struggle. Macken, the analyst, concludes, the activists enact modes of freedom and equality that the dominant order of sense denies. Okay, just returning a minute to Tom Paine, right? Modes of freedom and equality that the dominant order of sense denies. Above all, the freedom to engage in practices in which one steps out of one's assigned roles and reconfigures the world. So, getting to the conclusion, like Paine's common sense, hashtag Black Lives Matter is a timed, crafted, strategic set of actions. As founder Alicia Garza wrote, Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where Black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise. It is an affirmation of Black folks' contributions to the society, our humanity, and our resilience in the face of deadly oppression. End quote. This intervention has put out an analysis and spread it globally and almost instantaneously, or over many instances, with political clarity and directness. Like Paine, its millions of authors describe the utter corruption of systemic autocratic power and the threats and realities it enacts. Although radical and confrontational, those circulating the hashtag have touched the reality of hundreds of thousands of Black people's experience, making the movement and its demands common sense, even as the explosion of conversation around the slogan followed a long period of political quietude. Unlike Paine, however, Black Lives Matter demands more than a political revolution in which the basic structures of class and race and gender remain, even as political reforms are undertaken. The movement identifies a need for a thoroughgoing social revolution. It is clear that the use of the hashtag mobilized people to become involved in self-education and embodied public protest, like the Black Lives Matter syllabus, which has been circulated by radical educators in primary, secondary, and higher education. This fact also brings me back to the insight about common sense and ideology that Paine understood, that political education in the workplace, in the schools, in meetings, in coffee shops, in bars, and in the streets, political education must challenge the hegemonic common sense, the position of unquestioned political legitimacy of those who control society and its resources. That hegemony is sustained by common sense, which represents the place from which any genuine political education must depart. On this point, Walter Adamson argues, from the point of view of political education, common sense is not only its necessary starting point, but its most formidable obstacle. To supersede existing common sense, the man in the mess, or this is not my phrase, ordinary people must somehow be led to a series of negations which expose and repudiate prevailing common sense. And when workers, including every category of diversity and oppression, face the concrete reality of their experience of exploitation and oppression, and collective organized political discourse and action put language to that experience, workers experience a catharsis in which doubts about the necessity of change are overcome by rationality and agency. It's easy to see how Paine's common sense and the organizing and rhetoric of Black Lives Matter have served the purpose of catharsis and the replacement of existing common sense in favor of an analysis of abusive power and a strategy to defeat it. New networks, new protest repertoires, and new perspectives can embolden and enable a real fight against racist violence and an economic system that depends upon that violence to discipline black bodies in what Michelle Alexander called the new Jim Crow. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor has argued that Black Lives Matter movement represents a black awakening after the murders of Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Sean Bell, Amadou Diallo, and the accumulation of many others. The explosion of protest shattered the illusion of a post-racial society. Just as the open casket funeral of teenage lynching victim Emmett Till did in 1955, the image of Mike Brown's body left in the street sparked an uprising that has grown into a movement characterized by multiple organizations and demands. The invigoration of this movement, Taylor argues, will require a deepening of solidarity and demands, tying the struggle for higher wages, housing justice, education justice, and union struggles if it is to get not only at the expressions of racism, but their deep causes in our economic system. Taylor also takes a position on the American Revolution and the Civil War. She argues that a vision of freedom imagined as inclusion in the mainstream and financial institutions is impoverished. Not only did the emancipation of slaves fail to end even the most brutal expressions of racist injustice, but the election of the nation's first black president corresponded actually to an escalation of racist violence on the part of the carceral state. Inclusion has come, she writes, and failed. Black liberation therefore requires a strategy to organize across differences, to understand the origins and nature of black oppression in order to fight more broadly in the struggle for human liberation. Taylor returns to the voices and struggles of the post-World War II black radicals like C.L.R. James, Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, and others who named the economic system that generated and benefited from racist oppression, capitalism. Sean Monahan observed that in his writings, Rights of Man and Agrarian Justice, Paine moved in a similar direction to make more and more radical challenges to inequalities in the ownership of property, to condemn profit as the product of taking more value from labor than one pays the laborer, and to call for a revolution in the state of civilization. The task of black liberation requires a social revolution through and through. The organizers of Black Lives Matter, whose timing, platform, and message have sparked a new militancy, are the exact right voices at the exact right time. What remains is to solidify militancy for the fight to come. Paine successfully tapped similar outrage and made a similar call. And I want to hear that call again in the context of Black Lives Matter and the goal of separating from autocratic and violent authority. Paine wrote, rethink this again in the context of Black Lives Matter. Hath your house been burnt? Hath your property been destroyed before your face? Are your wife and children destitute of a bed to live on, or lie on, or a bread to live on? Have you lost a parent or child by their hands, and yourself the ruined and wretched survivor? Reconciliation, like an agreeable dream, hath passed away. Everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The blood of the slain, the weeping voice of nature cries, 'tis time to part. Thank you. How,
Based on your talk.
do I just stand here? Okay.
Yeah, or you can come down if you want.
Well,
Tony, did you print out a copy of the questions?
so, and they can be about this or they can be about the other chapter. Yeah. Can I close this outline now?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, did it help? Okay. All right. I'm going to sit. All right. All right. Do I need the microphone though? Can you all hear me? Okay. Very good. Oh my God, these are a lot of questions.
Well, we can see if people have their
Okay.
questions first.
All right. So yes.
So in Thomas Paine's time, the conduit to public communication was much more vertical. You had to be illiterate, you had to know somebody with a press, and the distribution mediums were much more isolated. And now, we're living in a much more democratized, in a very literal sense, in the technological sense, a much more democratized era, which is beneficial. Part of the reason we have footage of Eric Garner, part of the reason we're able to see firsthand accounts of chemical attacks in Ghouta and Douma are because these tools are in everybody's hands.
Right.
Right? And that's a huge driver for social change. At the same time, there's a dark side to that, right? Anybody can say anything, which also means that anybody can say anything. And it gives voice to people who have very perverse, often violent views, and also allows for an echoization that legitimizes those views in certain subcommunities. A lot of us in the room were media studies students, we're artists, we're media producers. I'm wondering what responsibility do we have, or what can we do to sort of mediate that conversation? And at the same time, I'm personally a first amendment textualist.
What does that mean?
Somebody who I do not personally believe on limits on freedom of speech. I think that's one of the greatest cornerstones of our country, of our democracy, is the fact that anybody can say anything that they want. In contrast to countries like Germany that have very stringent hate speech laws, where you can be jailed and fined for without resorting to, like, is that a solution in our society?
Okay.
Or
Yeah.
is there something that we can do as artists too?
I'm going to forget all your question before you get to the end to it.
The
So.
question is, what's our responsibility as artists, as media producers,
right.
and do we have to resort to
Okay.
limitations?
But a couple things that you said leading up to that were really important. What he said leading up to that. So one thing was about whether now the lateral explosion of popular capacity to contribute to media has generated an atmosphere in which anything goes, and people can put up, obviously fabricated and often hateful crap. And then what should we do in response to that? And what is the role of media makers and other mediators? And so I want to come back to that concept, because you who are critics, analysts, and makers of media, like me as a teacher and scholar and critic and activist, that we can play the role of mediation in a responsible way. And that I personally think that work is more effective face-to-face, because when you can engage people's embodied experience, you can easily contradict the bull that's happening at the top of society. Whereas if you're in a virtual environment, I think it's much harder. And I actually think that doing that face-to-face means that you generate organizations. Oh, sorry. That you generate organizations of other people who can also then become critical mediators. And so I would say, oh, and about the free speech point, no, I agree. I mean, as a socialist, I would always defend the principle of free speech, which is not to say that I would not confront, white supremacist haters in the streets given the opportunity. So I think we should meet hateful speech with other speech. I think calling on administrations to censor that stuff is wrong. But I think the principle of free speech is crucial to our struggle, because if we let go of that, then we can't produce those other mediators in social movements that we need. Yeah.
I have a question that relates back to the woman who you were speaking to in the train station.
Yeah.
And if this is too personal, forgive me and ignore it. I am wondering how you resist the urge to be reactionary and alienate people.
Yeah.
And what are your, I guess, like, can you talk about your opinions on transformative justice a bit?
Thanks. Yeah. And actually, I think that is a moment, like a teaching opportunity. And you know how Gramsci talked about working class education that I mentioned, how we should start with people where they are with their experience, and then ask a series of questions and raise a series of contradictions that make them reconsider the common sense that they have. I think that for me, I mean, when anybody I teach speech and debate, so when everybody says, well, we can't have that political conversation, I'm like, all right, we are on. But I mean, the way that I don't even think I need to resist the temptation to lay into someone, because the fundamental principle, one of them of my book, is a rejection of elitism. This rejection of the idea that people with bad ideas are stupid and evil, right? So I would never start there. So I would start with where the woman is coming from in terms of her life experience. I didn't have a lot of time. So we shared common ground around Hillary Clinton being a war criminal, agreed. We had some common ground, but mainly I just wanted to hear about what kind of benefit she thought that Trump would bestow upon ordinary people, including herself. And she basically called attention to how the economy was thriving and how he promised to make America great again. And I pointed out how, well, he's not. Anyway, so it was a short but pointed conversation. But like I said, afterward, she just thanked me for not being hostile toward her, while recognizing that I was coming from a very different place. And maybe she went home and thought, and maybe not. And I can see her again at the train station, right? But what's cool about teaching is that you see the same people over and over again, right? And I think that we can think of ourselves as critical intellectuals, as mediators of knowledge that can really start with people where they are. I mean, I think that's just a sign of respect and a recognition that, just like Paine knew, the people around us have hold of a common sense that has been there for a freakishly long time, right? So to get them to suddenly say, oh, you're totally right, capitalism sucks and racism is bad, and some people will come to that conclusion quickly, and other people will never come to that conclusion, and a lot of people will come to it slowly. I just think it's respectful to start where people are and try to do that little moving thing that Paine did, right? Yeah. Yeah.
Just as like a follow-up to that, how do you find the energy to like educate people like that and have the patience to like remain calm when talking to someone like a Trump supporter? Or because it is exhausting, like I don't know how often you do it
All the time.
I'm not always in the mood to talk to people about that stuff or like have the patience.
I'm fueled by involvement in a radical organization, the International Socialist Organization. I've been a member of it for nearly 30 years. And it is kind of a home place, where we talk about ideas and then how to talk to other people about ideas. And so that's a source of, when you have strategy and tactics and ideas about how you're going to go about things, it's much less exhausting because you're not improvising on the spot all the time. Right? And so I think organization is, and also you don't have to do everything. And so organization is kind of a restful and reinvigorating domain. And like I said, I mean, being an educator, I just kind of like take a deep breath and realize, okay, so I'm going to teach today, And in the sense that, yeah, sort of laying it on the floor in your classroom is also exhausting, but it's also just really rewarding. And I think having a good political argument with someone that makes them think and maybe come back and talk to you again later is also rewarding. And I think it's that experience of seeing people change that is the energy source. I don't know how else to say that. Yeah. Oh, and I sleep a lot, actually. I need a lot of sleep. Yeah.
I have to say, because early on in your talk, you mentioned that Saturday Night Live sketch.
Uh-huh.
The,
Welcome to hell.
hell and all that. And I find that one of the things, the great mediator in the current era is humor.
Yeah.
Humor is very powerful, in terms of mediation and also spreading information.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people now get quite a bit of their news through humorous sites and humorous
Yeah.
shows, such as The Daily Show and other programs like that, like John Oliver Show and other shows such as that. And now the late night comedians, Colbert and everyone else, they're now getting that information from them because they feel like these people, these hosts, are in many ways, while they're being humorous, they feel more, honest, they're more factual and less bound to some of the common sense, or common sensism, if you will, of regular media that tends to view everything in certain ways for various reasons, whichever network you can.
Right. Thank you. I was hoping somebody would ask this question because I feel ambivalent about humor because on the one hand, I totally agree with what you said, that it seems to be a non-threatening place where some actual information could be delivered because it's entertaining. There's a critic in rhetoric, his name is Kenneth Burke, and he's a very interesting dude. He died in 1993. He lived through the entire 20th century, pretty much. He lived from 1893 to 1994. Yeah, so anyway, long story. But he observed atrocity after atrocity, and he said, sometimes like earnest conversation is not gonna get you very far, but a moment of incongruity, a moment of surprise or disjuncture, he called it the comic corrective. And he didn't only mean humor. He just meant any time where where you get a jolt of contradiction or exposure to something and be surprised. He thought that was very important. But the way that humor works, I think in our society, I feel ambivalent about it because everybody who watches Trevor Noah or John Oliver, Stephen Colbert less now, but is already liberal. I mean, you have to be kind of in an in-group to know why that's funny, right? If you didn't already have a problem with Donald Trump, if you didn't already, have certain liberal beliefs, that stuff would not be funny. You would be really chafing. You would be really irritated. And there's study after study of this, including a study of Archie Bunker, and including a study of Dave Chappelle. Anyway, so the other thing is that with irony, in particular satire and parody, people can read it straight, and they do. So that people could read, people read Stephen Colbert's persona as actually, him. And not because they were stupid, but because they had a pre-existing common sense that asked them to frame things in particular ways. And so people with a certain kind of set of ideas respond great to that humor. Other people, I feel like, don't watch it because it would be just painful. I mean, it's not funny. It's not funny when you are a working class person, ordinary person, any person being mocked. And so a lot of that humor depends on mockery too, mockery of the right, mockery of conservatives. And I don't know, I don't think that woman in the train station is going to tune in to Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. I just know. And so there's an in-group audience. Irony can backfire. And then the other thing is that it might do that catharsis effect. It might do that critique effect, but it has no agentive political direction. It doesn't have. It doesn't propose a path for actually changing things. You can feel good. You feel good because your view of the world is validated. Yay, that's hilarious. Yeah.
So as a society, like a lot of people have a problem with talking about politics
Right?
And I'm the type of person who's like you, who's like, no, I'll listen to your side,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll have a conversation about it where there's no yelling and screaming.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that we can get people to start talking? Because I feel like that's a very big problem as to why there's the left and the right instead of a middle ground that can actually work things out and actually compromise on stuff. Because that's why, you know, who we have in office now is it's one side and the other instead of one whole unit, because no one has that conversation. So how do you think as a society that we can change that to where it's more acceptable to talk about politics?
I want to say I have a limit condition on the common ground reaching to people where they are, and that is Nazis or white supremacists of any kind. I will not engage them where they are. I would rather punch them. I mean, I just think that they have no place. Huh? Well, punch a Nazi, yeah. And this is why the right wing got so mad at me. I'm sure you're recording and you're going to send it, and then Ann Coulter is going to send it to her 2 million followers, and I'm going to be in for another round of hate mail, yay. But in response to the question is, I think we need to create civic spaces, meetings, classrooms, organizations, street fairs, like, go into a pub, but basically have something to start with, a newspaper, an event, a topic to talk about. And the other thing I think that would help a lot would be to expand our political vocabulary beyond Democrats and Republicans, because you can disagree a lot there, but people are often like surprised when you can point to a political alternative that actually left political alternative that can actually sort of make sense of the world in a way that is not about scapegoating and hatred. Then almost a lot of people want to have that conversation. But if you get out of the sort of narrow political box of Democrats and Republicans or Trump or Clinton or whatever, that's why a lot of times I'll start like I did with the woman in the train station, which is that I didn't like Hillary Clinton either, right? Because it's true. I think she was a horrible candidate, and the election was hers to lose, and she lost. So, but then she was saying, well, Hillary Clinton has a lot of mental issues, and I'm like, well, okay. And I said, I don't want to focus on mental issues. I want to focus on what she did when she was Secretary of State, you know. But I'll often start there to try to get the conversation, like, not to be about Trump and Clinton, because that's just all about capitalism, you know. How to manage it one way, how to manage it another way. And the one way, like Comey says, is kind of like completely untethered from reality. But the other way would be tethered to a reality that's pretty scary too. So I don't even know if I'm making sense. But yeah, but I think that I'm optimistic about it because I organize. So I go to the Workers' Center, I go to picket lines, I hold meetings, I speak all over the place about academic freedom. I teach, you know, so I see so many productive opportunities for these conversations that are real, like they're real. Even silly things like I'm in the socialist organization, and we have literature tables every week on the campus, and people will stop by and argue with us about whatever, right? And it's really fun. And some people will be like really antagonistic, and other people will just have a lot of questions. And but it's just like we all should practice sort of a public citizenship, even if it's uncomfortable. I think that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So we talked, like your speech presentation touched on the Black Lives Matter movement, civil justice, things like that. And one of the things I've always thought about and dealt with is the idea that all institutions and organizations are rooted in oppression. Like, if you look at American law enforcement throughout the country, northern, southern, no matter where, the root of all of these things is in a desire, or was in a desire to oppress those below them.
True.
Do you think that it is possible for organizations that's original intent was in persecution become organizations meant to protect and defend?
No, we need entirely different organizations. You know, like I said, that there's their truth and ours, their common sense and ours. There are their institutions and ours. And we would need to run them in the interests of ordinary people. And I don't think that the police or the criminal justice system or the political system that we have could be like reformed in a way that was accountable to the interests of oppressed people. That's why I'm a revolutionary. But I mean, I honestly think that the police especially, just riven through with racist motivation in terms of disciplining black bodies after the end of slavery and especially after the Jim Crow period, just completely, that was why. That was why we have police. So, and that's why so many Klan members are cops too. And we're cops. Yeah, carry on.
Just what you were saying, like, I think it's like a month ago, I was back home in Rochester, and, cop pulled me over, handcuffs on that whole night.
Jesus Christ.
Didn't give me a ticket, but, all that sort of stuff.
You were handcuffed?
I get handcuffed at least. If I get pulled over, I get handcuffed. I'm large and brown. I get handcuffed. But so, I was taught.
Even though he wasn't going to give you a ticket, he just handcuffed you.
He just ran my license, but he handcuffed me while.
Jesus Christ.
And I was telling that story to somebody I work with, and they were like, "Oh wow, that's crazy. Like, why would they do that?"
Yeah.
Like, why would they do that? And do you think? That's another question, I guess. Do you think that there is an intrinsic, just an imperative difficulty in America for white people to want to either not be able to or opt not to try to understand when it comes to the difficulties black people face when it comes to police?
That's so hard. I know in my class, one time we were talking about the police in my class, and I wasn't.
Also, random sentence. I don't have any priors or anything. So it wasn't like you ran my
I'm not even worried about that. So, but here's my class, right? And somebody asks something about, like, when you get pulled over, what happens? And a black student raised their hand and basically said, like, there's this entire protocol where you show your hands, and there's a paradox because you're supposed to get your driver's license, but keep your hands up. Like, I don't know how you do that. And right? And so you're like, okay, my driver's license is in the cubby in the dashboard, and so I'm reaching down, to get my driver's license, and that's when they just freak out, and so the whole, so one of the students said that what he does is basically hold the wheel and ask the officer to get his driver's license so that he doesn't have to put his hands anywhere that will get him shot. Who has to live like, black people have to live like this, who has to live like this? And I think that it's a symptom of horrible injustice, and it's a complete revelation of what the police are for in our society, and it's obviously got devastating and deadly consequences. Okay, so the second question is, thank you for sharing that. I'm still appalled that you got handcuffed. That's appalling. It's appalling. Okay. Well, that's more appalling. All right, so, but the other question about white people, I think that the appeal of white supremacy is palliative. It makes some white people feel better, white men mostly, feel better about being in a situation of being precarious or anxious or unsafe, or and sort of the explanation that white supremacists give is that it's those black people or those immigrants or whoever that's causing your anxiety. I think that then there are a whole middle layer of white people who are have a lot of anxiety about race and about talking about race, and I think that they're reachable. I just wish that they would stop talking about white people. You know what I mean? Like whole organizations of white people talking about racism, talking about white people. But I do think that it's similar to what I was saying before, like if I can, because it's not your responsibility, approach a white person who is struggling to answer the question about why their life sucks, and I could offer a better explanation than a white supremacist, and then I can talk about how people have interests in common across race, that divide and conquer is the primary mechanism of a hierarchical society, and that keeping us apart is doing us all in to different degrees. That having an opportunity to have that conversation, I don't have a lot of, and I don't know, being an activist, it just doesn't come up that often for me. Well, in my classroom it does. I don't know, I have to think about this question some more, because I think that the goal would be to help people understand interests in common and act in solidarity without disavowing like the real differences there are among people, and condemning racism without making every liberal white person feel like it's their own personal fault. Because, other people think it is every white person's personal fault, and I totally get that. So, but what I'm saying is, if you're going to organize and you're trying to do cross-racial, interracial organizing, that's how I would go about it. Yeah, go ahead, then I have to talk to someone else.
Have you ever seen the Tom Hanks Black Jeopardy sketch?
No, let's talk about that in a minute, because there's another hand, yeah.
I was just wondering if you, as a white woman, feel that way, because for people of color, it's harder because there's a lot of emotion involved.
Yeah?
And so a lot of the time, it is an elitist for me to not talk to a Trump supporter.
Sure.
Not feel obligated to make them understand, because I don't feel like they.
No.
So it's a lot different dynamic having a conversation like that as like a woman of
Yeah, no, I totally.
color. So it's like, I don't know. To me, it doesn't feel elitist to do that. It feels like
Right.
that's not where I want to start.
I totally get that. And I would agree with you that it is not your responsibility to educate white people or white supremacists, especially a bright, yeah. Yeah, no.
Like white people not wanting to understand. You mentioned earlier, like people being a product of the time and being a product of their environments. But we live in a time that information is so accessible that I don't feel obligated to educate someone that like has access to the internet and has access to educate themselves and find answers.
But the problem is they're going to go looking for answers that explain their situation, and there's a bunch of answers, right? And one of them might be scapegoat immigrants, So I think that it's my job. It's not necessarily. I think you make a really great point that that asking oppressed people to sort of educate white people who are scary. They pose a real danger. I don't think that should actually be the case. Yeah.
I actually had that experience in high school. When I was in high school, I was sitting, it was me and my two Asian friends, and we were in the corner. And the rest of the girls in my class were white in my homeroom. And my teacher was talking about race, so all the girls were like, oh, they were talking about different things. And they decided that we would be the three
Oh,
girls
right.
supposed to talk about
Right.
everything. My teacher was like, oh, look, the three girls of color, they're sitting in the corner together. And she was really pointing it out. She actually said that, and it was really embarrassing.
Yeah, that's called the burden of representation, and you shouldn't have to bear it. Yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the interview yesterday with James Comey.
I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Did it air? Did the interview air? Or
Yeah, I streamed it afterwards, but
I couldn't find it.
A lot of it was James Comey, who's for anyone that doesn't know, he's the former director of the FBI. He says things about Donald Trump being a liar and being unfit for the position because he's a liar, he's morally unfit. And made it clear that basically when he was doing a lot of things at the FBI concerning investigations into Hillary Clinton and investigations into Donald Trump, or people related to the Trump ballot or whatever, that he felt it was his responsibility to make it clear that the FBI was an independent agency that was supposed to kind of like say this is what's true and this is what isn't true. And so basically when I'm asking is, do you feel like the FBI as another part of the U.S. government can be seen as an independent especially in like the context of Donald Trump?
yeah, no, there's a moment in my book where I talk about how strange it is after the election that liberals and progressives and radicals suddenly think the FBI and the New York Times and the Democratic Party are all truth tellers, right? Right before the election, the deep state, no, we don't think that those are impartial representatives of any kind of truth. They're like all into secrecy. That's the whole business of the FBI, right? And so, they're not, purveyors of transparent truth, and that we always were critical of the commercial media for its ideological justifications for the society until Trump gets elected, and all of a sudden Washington Post puts a banner on its masthead that says democracy dies in darkness, and now all the liberals are like, yay, Washington Post. And so but the FBI, that's a really deep irony, yeah.
So in other words, no.
No. And I also think there's another game that's getting played there. Not only is the FBI getting rehabilitated somehow in the public imagination, but also still keeping a focus on Trump lied, he went to Russia, there were prostitutes, I helped Russia intervene in the election and damage Hillary Clinton, I'm really sorry. But while that's going on, there's like a war in Syria and massive strikes going on around the country for workers' rights, and devastating crises of poisoning in the United States, like the water in Flint, and now they're saying in Chicago. There's just everything happening, and everybody's talking about this teeny narrow range of what counts as politics. And the picture has to be much bigger than that. And so zooming out, I can say, I don't really care about whether Russia intervened in the political system in the United States. Because if Russia didn't intervene, somebody's going to intervene. The Electoral College is a product of a slaveholder system anyway. So, it's just kind of like when people are obsessing about that, it's like fact checking, and they're not thinking about all this other stuff. Yeah.
Thank you for showing up and taking the time to speak to us today.
My pleasure.
My question is, well, it's kind of an observation, and then I'll get to the question later. Okay, so I agree with your talk that that imaginations of change or the manumissions of the struggles of the proletariat rests in our ability and in our capacity or our willingness to speak truth to power, if that makes sense. But I disagree with you, however, in the notion that truth only resides on the left.
Oh,
Right?
no.
There seems, in some points you made that clear, but the general sort of theme seems to suggest that the right is wrong, and the left is right, and the left are the ones who have all the facts, right, and they have to constantly be the ones checking the right. So if the goal, I'm kind of thinking about this out loud, if the goal is to get everybody together or to erect change that will benefit both sides, wouldn't you agree that it would be in everyone's best interest, or it would be, or if we would have these discussions, that it would be a constructive discussion to presume that right also exists on the right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was excellent, what you said. And throughout the whole book, I try to basically say that the ideas of the right are right for the class that they support. And the ideas of the left are correct for the people who are hailed by it, because it offers explanations that shun scapegoating, division, and advocate for a society where people don't live in a precarious way. So, and where there are no police. So what I'm saying is, I do believe the left has a better story to tell that is faithful to the interests and realities of ordinary people, and that the right-wing story can be compelling for people, and it can be their truth, and I don't want to denounce it, but it's not going to be a story. At the end of the day, in The Woman in the Train Station, Trump's promises, the story about making America great again, is not going to solve her problem. It was not in her interest to buy into that. I'm not going to bash her for that. I don't think she's stupid, but it's the dominant explanation. And so the left is not the dominant explanation. It's an alternative, and I feel like so I always say there are their truths and ours, but I think that ours are better because they represent the interests of the vast majority of the world population in terms of having a kind of society that's run in the interest of the vast majority of the world's population. I mean, but I think your question is really insightful, and I think it's very interesting. It's very interesting because I develop a fidelity-based standard, so a faithfulness to the audiences that are being hailed by the communication, as opposed to a truth standard. So, and that's why fact-checking is not nearly as important as frame-checking.
You want to explain that a little more?
Fact-checking?
The fact-checking versus frame-checking, just to...
Oh, okay. So it's from the other chapter. That fact-checking is all, like you say, check the right. It's like, I call it the daily advent calendar of mendacity. I mean, that people count all the little boxes of Trump's lies. So I think now they keep making a new count, and it's obviously thousands and thousands of times that Trump has lied about things, and he lies about having lied about them too. So he's a meta liar, and that's absolutely true. He's a big fat lying liar. But I think that actually calling him to task on those facts just misses the way that he has told, however ineptly, a story that captured the imagination of some ordinary people in this country because he promised them a less precarious life. And so that's a frame, so he's framed sort of the problem of America not being great, or the task of making America great in a very particular way. And I think we should be in the business of checking that frame and basically saying that is not the way to make America great again. Not like this is a lie, this is a lie, this is a lie. We have to address it at the level of this is not the way to make America great. You know what I mean? So a narrative and myth making and emotional connection, how the left needs to understand how those things work, especially in making mass media. I mean, because it's all spectacle, it's like all, to understand how that works. And I have I'm sort of rambling now, I'm gonna stop. But fact-checking is extremely bureaucratic and narrow-minded, just like that debate between the Democrats and the Republicans. And frame-checking is like, whose story of reality is getting told? And could we tell a different story of reality, And would that story of reality be more faithful to my interests as a human being than that other story? How can I make my story more compelling? How can we as mediators make our stories from below more compelling? To produce a counter common sense, right? What kind of work does it take to do that? And so it's not exactly about being accountable to facts. It's about being accountable to the people, if that makes any sense. I think, I was going to add, though, one thing about, I have an extended example in which I mock Al Gore for inconvenient truth. I just want to say, that is the most fact-checky, bureaucratic, not use of a visual medium that you will ever see in your life. I encourage you to check it out. Okay, so.
How many people have seen Inconvenient Truth?
Okay, so you agree? Dull, bureaucratic, not the best use of television or recording media? I don't know. Yeah.
If Payne was alive, in this day and age, what do you think his opinion would be on the current political situation?
Oh my God. I mean, I can only hope and assume that he would regard Trump as King George III, just a completely absurd and illegitimate leader. But and I think that he would be rallying around radical causes. That's what I think, but. You can always write me. I'm at, okay, go ahead. Who?
Oh, okay.
Somebody.
Just real quick, I was living in New York in 2014, 2015 during the Ferguson resistance. There were a lot of protests, and I went out and I wanted to get involved and I went to organizing meetings, but I always felt very self-conscious as a white male, right? You go to those organizing meetings, and nobody needs another white guy, raising their hand and adding their voice. So I was trying to figure out what is my role in this, and I ended up as a live streamer. That's what I did when I went out to march. I'm wondering so the other part of that is I worry that allowing us to frame Black Lives Matter as just an issue for people of color, or Standing Rock as just an issue of people of color, allows us as white people to abdicate our own responsibility.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering, how do we, what is our middle ground here? How do we enable without injecting? And how do we become, do we offer the medium or?
I think this is really interestingly connected to the question about whether oppressed people should engage oppressive people where they are, and I've been ruminating on that, which is so not true. So that's the job of white people, right? Like we can do that work. But the other thing is when I'm in movements that are diverse and where there is an effort to build solidarity across difference, I feel like the best way to establish common cause in good faith is to do work. I mean, it's just to do work. And in the process of doing work together, then you reveal yourself to be trustworthy, and then conversations can happen on that basis, because now it is known that you are truly committed to the ending racism, right? So if you're doing the work, I haven't ever known someone like at our worker center, which is mainly for it organizes Latino workers, our Black Lives Matter chapter. I mean, no one in those Palestine Solidarity Group. I mean, if you just show up and do the work, and definitely try to not talk immediately. But I think there's work to be done to talk to Black people and to other oppressed minorities about solidarity and common cause and how our interests are conjoined, even though a lot of white people don't know it.
Okay,
thank you. I have books if you want to buy my book. I'll sign it.
Great.
Thank you.